So there's this real sense that Pete Buttigieg has really never understood what he was secretary of. And I think that this last thing probably forever cooked his hopes of being a legitimate candidate for president for the Democrats.
What matters more, words or action? Of course, it's nice to have both, but for the people of Ohio and Pennsylvania who've been living in a chemical train disaster, they would gladly take the action over the words at this point. So while President Biden was walking around Poland, former President Donald Trump flew to Ohio to try to let the people there know that America did care. Joining us tonight, TBN's Mike Huckabee, who served in public office for many years, managing every sort of incident that came up while he was governor of Arkansas. So it's good to see you, Gov. And first off, how could something like this happen? The federal government, and to some extent, the state of Ohio, kind of let weeks go by where there's a lack of information to the local people?
Rob, it's one of the greatest examples of dereliction of duty I've ever witnessed from the federal government, and there's really no excuse for it. First of all, Pete Buttigieg, the so-called Secretary of Transportation, who seems to be more interested in the diversity of his staff than he is the effectiveness of his agency, was one time a mayor, albeit not a very good one, but he was a mayor, so he understands that when there is a disaster, it is the executive of that community. It may be the governor. It could be the president, but the executive is the one who need to show up and at least provide some presence. Joe Biden has been a senator. He's been a vice president. He's been in government since he was in his 20s. He's been there for virtually almost 60 years in some form of government. And surely he knows that a disaster of this magnitude is not something that a president just sort of ignores and says, I'll get with you one of these days, but right now I got to go off to Poland and Ukraine. So it's an inexplicable dereliction of duty on the part of this White House and its staff. But today we did find out who was to blame, because the Biden White House announced that who's to blame? Well, of course, it's Donald Trump. And that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Somehow a regulation that was repealed in the Donald Trump administration was at fault, even though, quite clearly, from any honest recollection, it was most certainly not.
Sounds like the 24 presidential election's already underway. You dealt with crisis when you were governor of Arkansas. What are the things that you had to deal with, and how did you do it differently than what is being done now?
Well, I dealt with a lot of things. Ice storms had put 2/3 of the state without power for up to 3 weeks. That was a huge disaster, one of the most difficult. Many tornadoes, one of which went through the state, took a 250-mile trek of sheer terror. It looked like a B-52 had carpet bombed a big section of the state, killed scores of people, millions upon millions of dollars worth of damage. And then there was Hurricane Katrina, which, even though Arkansas was not a coastal city and didn't have the direct effect, we absorbed over 75,000 evacuees directly from New Orleans into the state in a space of less than 5 days, finding a place for those folks to live, taking care of their medical needs. There's a long list of things we did, but let me tell you what you do. The first thing you do is treat people like people. You don't treat them like pieces of paper or boxes. You recognize that this could be you, this could be your mother, this could be your sister who is involved in being displaced from their homes and being scared to death for what their future holds. So the first thing you do is you pay attention to the people concerns that are going on. And all that time, you're marshaling assets and resources to address the immediate concerns of things like, is it safe to drink the water? Is it safe to be on the streets? Is there some type of chemical in the air that can cause respiratory damage? And you bring in the best people you can. What you don't do is ignore it. And the sooner that you can show up and physically mount your presence with the people of that area, they don't expect you to fix it. They know that you're not going to come in and wave a magic wand and suddenly make it all better. But they also need to know that you are aware of it. And quite frankly, when you're the governor or the president and you show up, well, the media shows up with you. And it creates an attention that people feel like that maybe somebody is actually noticing what they're going through. That's one of the big reasons that it's important to physically show up at such moments.
I think President Biden might be able to get a pass for saying, or for not being there directly on the ground. Maybe he can, as president, be everywhere. But the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who you think in the back of his head is saying, I'm going to run for president if Biden doesn't, you think he would have been there immediately to deal with something like this, and he didn't. Let's talk 24 for a quick second here, because Politico is saying there's new speculation that Biden may not run. So that puts Buttigieg right up there with the talk of who would run for president on the Democratic side. This has to be, I think, a big no-no if you're running for president and you have the opportunity to kind of seize the moment, right?
Given how he's handled his office, not just this one event, but since he's been sworn in, I think he'd be better off opening a bicycle shop than he would running for president. He's been a no-show for many of the issues that have come to his department, and he's been more interested in taking private jets and flying around the world and taking his husband with him and telling us how diverse his agency is and how welcoming it is to people who are transgender and LGBTQ than he has about whether we're building roads and airports and getting our water systems fixed. So there's this real sense that Pete Buttigieg has really never understood what he was secretary of, and I think that this last thing probably forever cooked his hopes of being a legitimate candidate for president for the Democrats.
You know what no one's talking about in the last couple of weeks? Documents, China connection, Biden family business. Why is that? Why is it crickets right now?
Well, the main reason is because there's a greater sense of bewilderment on the part of the press as to why Joe Biden, after all these years, had classified documents, some stored in the most public of places, or at least vulnerable of places, like in his garage next to the car that Hunter would come over and drive. I wonder if Hunter ever loaded up some papers and took them off to his Chinese business partners. I mean, it's beyond embarrassing. It really is a dangerous situation. And for all the people who ripped their garments because Donald Trump had some in a locked box that he said were not even classified because he had declassified them, what we have are papers that should never been in the hands of a U.S. senator. Joe Biden was a senator when some of those papers came. Neither should they have been in the hands of a vice president, because a vice president doesn't have the same authority that a president does in declassifying documents. But this is a great example of how the press treats one side of the aisle quite differently than the other. And when it looks like it's really going to get embarrassing, they just suddenly forget that the issue even exists.